Okay, so welcome everybody. I've seen loads of familiar faces, which is great. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Laura Sandy, and I'm in the history department, and I work collaboratively with the International Slavery Museum with our, with our research centre. I'm a bit frightened of these because my voice echoes now, I can hear it too. But so the Centre for the Study of International Slavery. And we were wrapping up our programme for the year, for the academic year, and we got an amazing offer that Kris would come and talk to us about his new book, Black Ghosts of Empire, The Long Death of Slavery and the Failure of Emancipation. So Kris has come from America. He was due to do research in Birmingham, but there's some visa delays, so he'll be back, which means we can probably get him back in Liverpool again if we're a nice crowd. But at the moment he's in London. I'm going to give a short introduction to Kris because I know that Malik is going to give a more personal tale or story of how they met. I'm going to give a short introduction to Malik. I think that many people in the room know Malik already for a variety of exciting reasons. And then I'm going to hand over. We're going to have Kris presenting for about 30-40 minutes, and then we're going to go into conversation with Kris and Malik before we open it up for audience questions and then a bit more informal refreshments. So, Kris Manjapra is a professor. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm not echoing too much. He's a professor of history at Tufts University in Massachusetts, but he was born in the Caribbean, grew up in Canada, so a variety of experiences to reflect upon. He's written 5 books, so you can buy the one at the back. Here we are, and this is the American version, so this is come over from America, this is the UK version, so this will be a very special edition if you do buy it. But so Kris has written on topics of race, colonialism, reparations, and all sorts of exciting subjects. I was going to list your books, but there are many exciting things about you, and I don't want to steal the thunder from Malik. So aside from that, you're an activist. You set up the Black History. I've written some of these things down, just because I've been doing a lot of events recently, so I'm beginning to sort of merge things. So you set up the Black History in Action group, which is a non-profit organisation, so doing work with the community. Kris also offers free online community courses. He's written for The Guardian, so other newspapers, the Global Mail as well. And even at lunchtime today, I was astounded when Kris told me he was thinking of becoming an artist too, and taking photos of his lunch. So many interesting things about Kris. I'm sure you can ask him about that as well. One of the other things is that Kris was nominated for and won Diverse Magazine Emerging Scholar Award in 2015, and his epic research has been funded by many institutes around the world. So, so many things to say, not just a scholar but much more, really reaching out beyond academia too, which is exactly the same as Malik, who again is exhausted in his work. I could go on forever, but when we first met, I knew Malik as a poet and a performer. I didn't realise how much he was a historian. Malik has been researching, and again, across the city, he's given talks across the nation and across the globe about his search to find his family and the links to slavery. And he's been doing this for 15 years. And thankfully, this has been recognised in many different ways. And Malik's work is featured in on BBC. It's featured in The Times, The Daily Mail, something else. Where else have you published? You're a published author. I remember I was reading your bio thinking you published in so many different places. So aside from that, Malik's been working for Barriers to Black Academia, which is a project about pushing the government to change its policies about its approach to how academia and education view black applicants going into universities. So he can tell you about that as well. It's to diversify education in general, and we've got some good news today, which again, I'm sure you can talk about. So I'm going to hand over to you because I feel like I don't want to steal your thunder. So thanks very much for joining us, both of you.
I'd like to start by thanking Mary Booth and also Dr. Laura Sandy and the Dean of the Faculty, Alison Felt, who, when I first proposed the idea of bringing Dr. Kris Manjapra, Professor Kris Manjapra, over to talk in Liverpool, that they were very immediate in their response of being able to organise with his publishers, Penguin and House, to get him down here. So this has been organised really, really swiftly, and I think they understood from when I first proposed it to them just how unique and seminal Kris's work is. So just to give you a bit of background how I came across Kris, he and I were both invited to present a paper and as panellists at a symposium that had been organised by the CARICOM Reparations Commission, which is chaired by Professor Sir Hurley Beckle, Vice Chancellor of the University of West Indies. And it was in Antigua, with the Prime Minister of Antigua, Gaston Brown, around the issue of colonialism, Western banking, slavery and reparations. And a number of academics from around the world came to talk about various different entities, Wall Street, Swiss banks, and a variety of others. My own was about Bank of Liverpool and Barclays Bank, and Kris can tell you about the papers that he presented. But it was all around the idea and the concept of reparations, the liability for reparations and reparative justice for the injustices of the genocide of slavery and colonialism. So Kris and I met in Antigua, fitting location, and we immediately gravitated to one another, exchanged details and decided to try and do something together. And within about 5 minutes of coming back from Antigua, Kris was on a plane and he was here in Liverpool, writing his book and interviewing me for stuff to do with his book. And I was busy at the time trying to find a way to get my research acknowledged and recognised for a PhD. And I was struggling with, my background in social sciences. I don't have background in history, but it's a historical thing. How do I do it? And Kris really helped me and mentored me into, being able to formulate my idea and my proposal to be able to get it accepted. And I was accepted at Liverpool, Manchester and Cambridge, and I took up the place at Cambridge. And that is very much thanks to Kris. Without his guidance and mentoring, I probably wouldn't have been able to formulate it in that way. Because as a black academic, first in my family and so on, we find it very, very difficult to get the nurturing, if you like, is to know how to follow this pathway into the academy, which is why we did the symposium around barriers to black academia, and we're currently presenting 2 private members' bills through the Lords to look at amending the Higher Education Act of 2017 to do a variety of things, one of which will be to try and find ways to ring-fence funding for black academics to create a funding bridge through positive action. And Kris is doing a lot of work in America as well, as Laura has alluded to. But what really, really struck me about this particular book when Penguin Random House asked me to review it for the comments on the back of the book ahead of its publication was the manner in which he approached the issue, not just of reparations, but of emancipation and the issue of the end of slavery and the compensation. That was something, he did it in a way that I hadn't seen done before, and I thought this is a narrative that really needs to find a home. And I thought the Centre for Study of International Slavery is a great place to start this off. So without further ado, I'd like you to give a warm Liverpool welcome, please, to Professor Kris Manjapra.
Thank you so much. I hope you can all hear me well, and I want to begin by thanking Professor Sandy and thanking my dear friend and brother, and I see Lawrence in the room, and I want to say greetings, brother, to Lawrence, to folks who have been important to me in Liverpool, and also important as the work of being a writer can be very lonesome, and to know that there are others in the world who see the importance of a project means a huge amount, as we write and as we put words on blank page. And so as I speak, thanks to Mary Booth, by the way, as well, for wonderful organizing for this event. As I speak, and I'm going to talk for 40 minutes or so, I want to talk at the level of concepts, some of the important conceptual work that the book does. Some of what I have to say is going to be drawn directly from the way the book works, the way it's structured, but some of it is going to cut across what the book, how the book is organized to get to the key concepts. But beyond the concepts, I also want to share some stories, stories that come out of my own experience and some of the historical experience that I've researched. It's another way to say I want the book to both be, in some ways, about the airiness of our conceptual world, but also the earthiness of our narratives as Black people in the world. So that's what I'm going to try to do. I think in terms of a one-line beginning to the book, why this book is important and why it's important in 2022, my answer to that question is the more and more that we begin to, as a society or as societies on an international scale, talk about reparations for slavery, the more that this becomes a framework for national discussion. And it is taking place here in the UK, it's also taking place in the USA, it's taking place in nations across Latin America, in Africa, even in Asia. The more that happens, the more that I think it's important for us to frame reparations along with emancipation. In other words, we've misunderstood how slavery ended. The key term for that is, of course, emancipation. It ended through emancipations. But we misunderstood what emancipations were. And it's because of that that it's in some ways taken us so long to recognize how central reparations still are to our reckoning with this long history of slavery. If you think about it, so the one line is, we need to talk about emancipation if we're going to talk about reparations. That's my one line. But when you think about it, it's the case in the United Kingdom, it's also the case in the United States, that there's another concept, another key term that takes up almost all the oxygen in the room when we talk about slavery, and that's the key term of abolition, or increasingly in the United States, anti-slavery and abolition. When we use those key terms of anti-slavery and abolition, it prioritizes in our mind a story about ends, some things that ended, and or those who worked to bring slavery to an end. And this is not to take anything away from the abolitionists of yore, from the anti-slavery activists of yore. But the fact is that there can be no abolition, true abolition, without a process to make abolitionism into true abolition. And we never had true abolition. Abolition actually never came. Our world has never seen abolition of racial bondage, actually, even to this day, and that's because emancipations got in the way. So I want to talk through that argument a little bit more as we go. And just to foreground where I'm headed, after doing a little bit of kind of storytelling, and I'm going to just read from the first few paragraphs of the book, which I think articulate where I come into the picture, why I needed to write this book now. I want to then give you a sense of the bird's eye view of the argument of this book, and I'm going to show you a slide, and I'm going to talk about some of the key essential elements of how emancipations work. When we look at them, all 80 emancipations that took place between 1770 and 1880, they all had three main characteristics in common. So I'm going to talk about what those three main characteristics are. Then I want to switch gears and have some time to talk about reparations. We have a way of talking about reparations today, so I want to define what our contemporary discussion of reparations tends to be framed as. But then, based on the research of the book, I want to do some redefining of what reparations has long meant. So what are some of the key essential characteristics of reparations that are enduring, that date back from the first abolitionist projects and the first reparationist projects of the 1770s and continue to this day. So those are some of the steps that we're going to take together as I go through. Let me begin by, I'll take the first slide. Malik, thank you. I want to show you, let's see what picture we should, it's either going to be a map or it's going to be A blue hole. Okay, so we're going to start with the blue hole. And this is exactly what I was hoping for. So there's some storytelling, sort of begin with the earth, and then we move more towards the abstract and the abstract arguments. I needed to write this book because of this experience, the experience that I had around this particular pool, which is located on Andros Island, which is the largest island of the Bahamas, where my family is from. It's also the least populated of the islands of the Bahamas. It's an island that is populated not by people but by pine trees. And the reason why there are so many pine trees is because this was a pine plantation for the building of New England houses. And of course I now live in Boston, and Harvard University itself was constructed partly from the pine of Andros that was being cultivated on Andros Island under slavery. So there is a lot of connection between New England and the Bahamas, which I won't go into at the moment, but just to ground us in what it means, what it meant for me some years ago for the first time for me as a grown adult, to encounter this geological formation. It's called a blue hole. Blue holes exist across the Caribbean, they exist in Mexico, they exist in parts of China. What makes them unique is that in the limestone of the island rock, over time, as water continues to wash into the depression of this pool, it gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And over hundreds of years and thousands of years and tens of thousands of years, the water burrows a long column all the way down into the bedrock of the island. And the bottom is, well, I don't know how these can go down thousands of meters. You certainly can't see the bottom from when you're looking at the top. And when you peer into the blue hole, and that's what was so fascinating to me, there literally is an experience of peering into a void, of peering into something that's bottomless. And there's a very disconcerting experience of looking at an entity that you cannot comprehend. There's a true beauty to it, but it's also very disconcerting. And when I was in Bahamas and I first encountered, this was my first time going to Andros Island, because it's not where my family now lives. They live in Nassau. I went to Andros, Mastic Point. This is a northern tip of Andros. I went there in order to look for the story or stories about one of my ancestors, whose name is Lorena. And my book is dedicated to Mother Lorena, along with my own mother. And I know some very obscure things about this ancestor of mine, Ama Lorena. I know that she died in 1909. I know that she gave birth to 2 children. She died at age 19. She gave birth to 2 children. One of those children became my great-great grandmother, Sarah. So I know that Lorena is my third grandmother, my 4th grandmother, my great-great-great grandmother. I don't know where Ama Lorena came from. There are rumors in the family that she was mixed indigenous. There's a native community that lives not far from Mastic Point, part black, part native. There are rumors in the family that she actually came over in the slavehold of a ship coming from the Congo. And of course, Bahamas is very important in the slave trade, being a carapace of the Caribbean Sea, being a kind of articulating spine through which ships would enter deeper into the Caribbean, to places like Cuba and to places like Jamaica. They would pass through these islands, these 700 keys of the Bahamas. And that movement did not end in either 1807, which is the formal abolition of the slave trade. It did not end in 1833, which is the abolition of plantation slavery in the British Empire. It did not end in 1865, which was the abolition of slavery in the American South. it did not end in 1887, which was the formal abolition of slavery in Brazil. In Bahamas, slave trading continued. This trafficking of captured people continued well into the late 19th century. So this location of Andros Island is important because it represents a void in multiple ways. We can't get to the bottom of the story of how many people were trafficked into bondage. We cannot really get to the story of when the final enslaved person was brought from Africa to the Americas through this smuggling, through this area of human smuggling. Similarly, I couldn't get to the bottom of how deep the blue hole went. On the other hand, this same void is also a tremendous mirror. And you can see it in the picture that it's not, what I was struck by is when I was walking around was not just the fact that I couldn't see all the way to the bottom, but also that it made clear everything that it was around it. You know, the crescent of the pine trees and the sky above, there was a kind of a brilliant reflection that it was almost like a giant eye that this pool represented. It allowed me to see something. And strangely, and when we work with history and when we work with ancestors, I don't know if you've had that experience, but we often become aware that there's an intelligence, there's something more going on. There's something, there are messages that are being sent that we are being asked to hear. That's what I felt when I was here. And what I felt when I was peering into the blue hole, I could swear I could feel Ama Lorena telling me to look around, that she was there. You know, however much I wanted to find where she started, which I couldn't because we couldn't locate people in the village who remembered her or had memories of people who remembered her. She was lost to me in a certain sense through history. I also heard her or felt her tell me that this is not about a mystery that I cannot solve. This is rather about a recognition, a realization of her presence precisely where I was looking for her, that she was around. She was around, right? And I was walking around, and I felt her around. So it's about losing and finding, and that's where this this project emerges from. And so let me begin with just some words from the first paragraph, and then I'm going to switch gears and move more analytically and conceptually to talk about the history of emancipations. The Bahamas, place of my birth, is a Caribbean nation state of 700 islands and keys, extending like vertebrae along the southern rim of the Sargasso Sea. Andros Island, the largest of the chain, is surrounded by tidal flats, coral reefs, karst formations, and lime muds along its rubble coasts. Atlantic waters undulate and crash at its shores, but they also penetrate into its pine-covered and craggy interior, burrowing deep cylindrical holes into the carbonate bedrock of the landscape. The island itself is pockmarked and eaten through by the alien sea. The last time I visited Andros, I was seeking to fill a void, a hole, in my family history. The island taught me something important about the presence inside voids and my relationship to them. The void is the most succinct encapsulation of Atlantic slavery and its ongoing afterlife. 500 years of racial slavery designated African-descended peoples as devoid of human value. It stripped them of their personal and family names, obliterated their kinship ties, and assigned them a market price as atomized pieces of human property. Slavery swallowed millions of Africans into the bellies of ships, enumerated and inventoried them, transported them across the seas, and spat them out into slave markets across the Americas and Europe. It was an incalculably traumatic system of genocide, tearing families apart and alienating people from their own sense of themselves, forcing them to reconstruct life, joy, and family again and again. Slavery constituted a centuries-long war against African peoples, and the emancipations, the acts meant to end slavery, only extended the war forward in time. Voids are complex because they are nothing at all, and yet everything at once. Inside the void, black people reconstituted life, kin, and community amid the terrorization and destruction of slavery and the plantation regime. They created new art and meaning in and beyond the whole of the ship and the void of the slave price. The enslaved rebelled and fled, tended to their ancestors, and fed and nourished their children. They saved money, organized political movements and strikes, and constructed communities of mutual care and succor. They loved, they celebrated and rejoiced, and made space for their own liberation from within slavery's trap. I'm going to pause on reading more, but it's the duality of the void that informs this book. It is the effect of emancipation laws and processes and what they continue to destroy, and the reparative actions that black communities necessarily took for themselves and for their kin, often in collaboration with others, multi-racial, multi-ethnic communities of solidarity, but organized by and around the black community who were trying to save their own lives, that the book is also interested in. So I'll take the next slide. So this is a map from the introduction to the first few pages of the book, and it shows that we are dealing with a global story, a planetary story of emancipations. Emancipations were not only salient, or not just a salient theme for the United States or for the British Empire or European empires in the Americas, but really allow us to look at world history in the interconnected history of the world in new light. This image, without going into great detail, shows that first there were many forms of emancipation. So there is not just one, there are many. Whether we think of emancipations that took place with compensation, without compensation, that involved indentureship or some form of apprenticeship, that involved an in-kind payment to slave owners. I will get into these details next. But there's a diversity here, a lot of variation. But what is the message in the noise from this map? The key message is that emancipations are taking place across the American North, the American South, the Caribbean, Africa, across Europe, of course, because these are the European colonies that we're dealing with. And if you look down into this corner, you'll see that emancipations and their policies and processes are also extending across the Indian Ocean, to South Asia, to Southeast Asia, and the story continues to the Pacific as well. So this is a global story. So I'll leave it there with this map, and we'll do some heavy-duty conceptual work next to break down the different kinds of emancipation before I take a big step back to draw out the three main characteristics that we can that we find when we look at all of these forms together. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So this slide gives us a chronology of some of those 80 emancipations that I mentioned that took place during what we might think of as the long century of emancipation, 1770 to the 1880s. There are 6 main types of emancipation that we can put all emancipation processes into if we wanted to categorize. So allow me to do that, and I'll do it relatively quickly, just so we give, I want to give you the frame, and then I'll boil it down to something that I think is the most essential of this comparative study. So I mentioned the 6 forms of emancipation. The first began in the 1770s and began in the American North and was called gradual emancipation. Keyword gradual. This form of emancipation was really invented in Philadelphia and in Pennsylvania, I should say, which had a lot to do with its Quaker roots. And emancipation as a term means to let free from his hand. It goes back to Roman law. It is a way to if you like, redeem or compensate the slave owner for the loss of their property and enslaved people. That's the essence of what emancipation laws did. Emancipations in Philadelphia did not pay cash to slave owners, but gave them control over the children of enslaved women for a period of time after emancipation took place. So concretely, in Philadelphia, 1780, emancipation takes place. Children who were born of enslaved women, and by the way, after the Philadelphia emancipation, all living enslaved people were to continue as enslaved people until they died of natural causes, or until the slave owner, on his own will or volition, decided to free or manumit that person. So it's not like the slaves were freed in 1780. Only the children who were to be born after 1780 were to be born as free. This was called post-nati emancipation. Except that, and this is histories of emancipation are always about exceptions, except that the children who were born were only to be freed after 28 years. So they were born, and only at age 28, whether woman or man, would they be actually freed. Until that point, they were considered apprentices or indentured persons, and they functionally had no right and no rights and received no wage for their labor. So that was the first, if you like, fatal flaw that gave birth to an international system of emancipations, and many of them would draw on what happened in Pennsylvania. Specifically, Zachary Macaulay directly was interested in what happened in Pennsylvania when he designed the British abolition of slave trafficking in 1807. Simon Bolivar was directly interested in what happened in Pennsylvania when he designed the Latin American emancipations that began in 1814, gradual emancipation. The second type of emancipation is called retroactive emancipation. And this took place in Haiti in 1820, specifically in 1825. Retroactive because the Haitian people had already liberated themselves. They did not wait. They were actually emancipated earlier in 1792, but that emancipation was a trap. And the Revolutionary War continued under Toussaint Louverture. And the Haitian people rejected the terms of the French state's emancipation, and they freed themselves through liberation in 1804, creating their own constitution, declaring themselves an empire. The French state rejected or refused to accept or recognize the sovereign Haitian nation, and for the coming 20 years boycotted Haiti on the international stage, the first black republic in the world. What a contrast to the way the French in 1783 were actually the first to recognize the North American revolutionaries of the country that would become the United States. So a very opposite response. In 1825, the King of France said that he would finally recognize Haiti as a sovereign nation and begin dealing with it through diplomatic and international conventions, only if the Haitian people would agree to be emancipated. But they had already liberated themselves. This was the retroactive emancipation that Haiti had to, in a certain sense, it's not in a certain sense, metaphorically, but this actually is depicted in so many images of how abolition happened. Haiti had to get down on its knees and crawl into freedom in order to be recognized as free by the French state. And so what that meant in 1825 was the taking out, the imposition on Haiti of the indemnité, which ultimately, historical money is hard to really grasp in terms of its significance, but it's often quoted today as about 22 billion $22 billion, the equivalent of $22 billion, that threw Haiti into a kind of careening tailspin of third world debt, which it continued to suffer until certainly the 1950s and continues to affect its economy to this day. That was the debt that Haiti had to pay, a generational debt, in order to be recognized as free by the French state, to have formal political recognition. So I want to underline that key term, debt. The third form of emancipation comes about 10 years later, 1833. This is the British compensated emancipation. And here, the key characteristic is that the British state not only kind of continues gradual emancipation with the indentureship system of bonded labor after emancipation happens, but now adds a new characteristic, a new feature, a new benefit. It sweetens the pot for the slave owners. And this time it's the cash payout, that there is now be a massive cash payout to the tune of 40% of the British state's gross national product, creating a debt legacy that British citizens and colonized peoples of the British Empire were paying continuously for 180 years, that the British citizens stopped paying only in 2015. That compensated emancipation took place between 1833 and 1838, and it set a new gold standard for how emancipation should happen. So in the years after the British emancipation, the French, the Dutch, the Danish, the Swedish, the Spanish, the Brazilians, the Americans in Washington, D.C., they would all use this set of policies, and especially the idea that if you're going to take the property right of slave owners away, you cannot do so without giving them a reparations, a cash dispensation, a compensation. That is the innovation of 1833. Then we move to the next form of emancipation, the fourth, which is the war emancipation of 1865. The key difference here is that because the US South was freed not through civil processes or civil law, but through war, there was no civil truce, there was no agreement between the slave owners of the South and the Union government. Basically, as the language was at the time, black people in the South were freed as contraband. They were freed as goods, they were seen as goods that were stolen away from the South, stolen away from the slave owners of the South, in order to be freed. However, the logic, the idea, the belief that the slave owner was the aggrieved party, not the enslaved, still haunted this 1865 moment in the Americas, in North America. And it's because of that the three Reconstruction Amendments of 1865, 1868, 1870, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, they all contained, often in their second or a subsequent article, they all contained a loophole that actually allowed for forms of bondage to continue. They did not rule out, they did not abolish slavery in the end. They continued it through the back door. But not only that, 10 years later, during the Reconstruction, 10 years later, at the end of the Reconstruction, during what's called the Compromise of 1877, there's a massive reparations that's paid in kind to the plantocracy of the US South. It's paid in a variety of ways, by giving back to the plantocracy power over taxation, by giving back to them also complete control over the electoral system, and by giving back also power over property. And of course the control over property, the restitution of property to plantation owners happened already in a major way in 1865, when President Johnson returned the lands that had been allocated initially as a kind of reparations for enslaved people. He gave those back just months after the war ended. So there's a lot of giving back to slave owners after 1865. There is none. There is no giving to the enslaved, on the other hand. there's a fatal flaw in emancipation that continues to replicate itself time after time. And we need to recognize it. We do need to pause and recognize that that's how history has happened. And then the final form of, well, there are two, but I'll go through the last one very quickly. The second to last that I wanted to mention to you is what I call what I call the conquest emancipation. In 1860s, just as the Civil War was being fought in the United States, an imperial war was beginning to be fought across Africa. And when we look at how the French and the British and the Portuguese and many other Belgians, how they leveraged and framed their imperial pursuits from the 1860s onwards, it was often in the language of being the emancipators. And when African sovereign nations were taken over during the scramble for Africa, that happened under the banner, under the aegis of African people being emancipated. And I can get into specifically emancipated from slavery, from African slavery. And I'll leave that as a question if you want to ask more about African slavery and emancipation and the particular kind of emancipation that worked out in Africa and also in India, which was not like the forms of compensated emancipation that took place in the Western world. But I'll leave that for you to ask about later if you like. The final form of emancipation I want to mention, the sixth form, is what I call the sea emancipations. And they took place beginning in 1807 and continued all the way through to the end of this emancipation century. They involved parole ships that would seize slave vessels on the seas in international water, take them to emancipation colonies such as Sierra Leone, lead the enslaved people out from the slave holds to courts, the mixed admiralty courts. But then, having passed through the court system, the enslaved were put into years of indentureship, years of bondage. 14 years became very standard. Sometimes, when sent to Brazil, the indentureship lasted for life. So it was slavery by another means, slavery under another name. Okay, so having covered those different forms of emancipation as depicted on this slide, I want to kind of boil it all down to three main categories, which is the takeaway from this kind of very analytical discussion. And the three categories, the essence of all emancipations are, number one, that they were designed according to gradualism. Gradualism was their key claim, that you could free enslaved people, but that their freedom could be a gradual quantity that would only become full at some distant point in the future. And therefore, black freedom always involved waiting. It always involved the waiting room. It was never full. And number two, emancipations always involved black debt. They always required, across the board, the enslaved people to carry, when they walked over that threshold from formal bondage to formal freedom, they walked into freedom with burdens on their back. And it could be a variety of burdens. Financial burdens, often it was moral burdens, the moral burden of needing to be somehow morally improved, to be earn or to to have the right to the kind of freedom that the society in which they lived had. So there's that kind of moral burden that the enslaved also carried. And then the third characteristic of all emancipations that have taken place in history, in addition to the first two that I mentioned, is that they all paid reparations to the enslavers. They paid reparations to the enslavers in multiple ways. Sometimes it was through cash. Sometimes it was through free labor. Sometimes it was through in-kind transfers. Sometimes it was through a mix of all of these three. But when we stop to think about that, I think it's worth us to be a little dumbstruck, because what it really shows is that emancipation processes were there in order to continue a right to racial property ownership, not to end a right to racial property ownership. These are forms of continuation of white property, not forms of ending the racial rule of white property. And I'm happy to define what I mean by white property. For our discussion, I think I'm just drawing on Cheryl Harris and other scholars who define this kind of property, this racial property, as not just property rights and land, property rights and people, but also the entitlements and the privileges and the respectability that property also involves. And this privilege, these forms of entitlement were rendered intergenerational, were made to pass down from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, not by accident, but by design. And the design is what we can call emancipation processes. All right. So those are some of the key arguments about emancipation that the book makes. And I want to, in my final few minutes, switch gears to talk about reparations and talk about reparations in two different ways. So Malik, if you could move it back to the blue hole slide. Good, thank you. So today, reparations, when you look at international law discourse, reparations is often, I think, very usefully defined as having a number of important characteristics. Number one, the demand for apology. Number two, the demand for restitution of stolen things, giving back what has been stolen. Number three, the demand for compensation, which is different from restitution. Compensation is the payment in some form for the harm that has been done. Giving back what is stolen is restitution. Compensating for the harm is compensation. There also, as in terms of international legal theory, there's also redress, which is the work of policy and culture to help us as post-trauma societies to make whole again what has been broken. It's another key characteristic of how people today talk about reparations. So I just wanted to kind of mention that because although, in popular discussion, we often take just one of those threads and kind of make it the whole of the conversation, which in the United States happens to be the thread of, how much should the check be? That's the conversation. Should it be $2,000, $2,500, $25,000? That's the level of where the imagination tends to be in popular discussion. And I have a feeling that, although you may correct me, that in the United States, that in the United Kingdom, when this term reparations is used, it also tends to immediately move to a discussion about monetization or the fear of, well, how much are we going to have to pay? That already is a problem for two reasons. Number one, it's not hard to imagine paying compensation for damage done, because that, after all, is embedded in common law, and Britain has done it in a variety of ways for centuries and centuries. But also because in every single emancipation in our world, compensation has been paid. It's been paid without question. It's just been paid to those who were seen to be the losing party, the slave owners. So what's the failure in our imagination that makes discussions around compensated payments so seemingly impossible when it comes to the historical descendants of the harmed, who continue to be harmed because the harm was never ended? But there's another issue with this focus on compensation alone, which is that it only is one of the many arms of what the full meaning of reparations means. And I mentioned, like today, legal theory thinking about at least 4 main categories. So, but in terms of my research in the book, I was uncovering what I would say is kind of an alternative way of thinking about what reparations means. I think it still means it today, but certainly historically what it has meant. If we look from the kind of archive and work from the archive as opposed to working from legal theory. And some of the features of reparations in practice, reparations on the ground, because of course Black communities have been struggling for reparations since the very moment that abolition was taking place. It's not like there was a vacuum and sometimes we hear people didn't know any better back then and they did the best they could. Well, it was a big debate, and there were Black people across the board always were asking, as any person would, to be made whole again and to be compensated for the loss and for redress. And when we look at what that looked like, one of its characteristics was that reparations meant the demand for apology. When there's a psychic value to that. For those who have done harm and have benefited from harm, to stop the lie about the harm, to stop what we call today gaslighting, or what in the book I call ghostlighting. There is psychological value, both for the liar and for those who had to kind of be the audience of lies. And in the 1790s, Ottobah Kogwano, he wrote that what was needed at the end of British slavery were days of amends and apology. That there should be ceremonies around apology and amends for the society to heal. That has never happened. And that's partly why the psychic pain, that's not only the psychic pain of the Black community, but there's a particular kind of psychic pain that's different that that white communities experience around this. It's because we're not given access to the power of amends. It's been shut off by vested interests and by elites, and that should end. So the need for apology has always been there. Kogwano also wrote about the need for restitution and for reparation. Those are his words. And certainly Black communities have, after every single emancipation, in a variety of ways, written to governments and courts asking for the return of what has been lost. Sometimes that was the return to their homelands, right? Because in the 1780s, 1790s, in that period, all the way up into the 19th century, people were stolen from their homes. So they, after being freed, they asked to very simply be returned to their families. That was a very important form of reparation that they demanded. And that was, again, in general, not granted. Another very interesting form of reparations that you notice in the archive is mutual aid. The demand, not just the demand, the practice, because the Black communities didn't just wait around. What they did is they created commonwealth together. And they did this, for example, in the early Black church, in the AME church, in places like New York and Philadelphia. They did this in the free villages across the Caribbean. They did this in the land movements that began in the US South after the end of US slavery. They created free schools in which they trained their young. They created common banks in which they pooled their wealth. So there is this healing of mutuality and creating not more and more private property, which, by the way, is the logic of how slave owners were compensated, but creating common property, creating shared property, shared wealth, common wealth. That's another form of reparations. Two last forms that I found in the archive. internationalism. So when we look at what, from the 1770s onwards, black communities were doing, once they were fighting the reparationist fight, is they were fighting it in diasporic solidarity, meaning in ways that connected the coasts of the crime scene. The crime scene was not just the Atlantic, it was also the Indian Ocean, it was the Pacific. And some concrete examples of that would be the work of Edward Blyden, for example, in Sierra Leone, or of Martin Delaney in the United States, or even of reparationists in the 1960s and the 1970s in the United States, or even Bernie Grant here in Britain, who imagined reparations as always a Pan-African pursuit. So I'll just say that as another very important dimension. It has always been imagined as something as broad and as big and as capacious as the African diaspora itself, including our brothers and sisters in Africa. And then finally, reparations in the archive has always involved the search for reciprocity, the return to reciprocity, which in some ways connects us back to the power of amends. Reciprocity is something that Julianne Cooper, who was a black theorist, philosopher, her parents were enslaved. She wrote in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, she wrote a lot about this concept of reciprocity. And she said what there needed to be was a general amnesty after slavery. It's an interesting term she used. Not a general emancipation, but a general amnesty. And what is an amnesty? An amnesty is the giving of safety to those who are homeless, or to those who are the migrants, or to those who have been rendered vulnerable. And to do that requires people returning to just relationship together, returning to reciprocity together. And therefore, reparations has to be seen as something that we all benefit from, whatever our place in the racial hierarchy of the society we live. It's only through reparations that we return to right relationship, to reciprocal relationship, and only then is there truly peace. That's the argument that Anna Cooper made. So I wanted to kind of run through some of those different qualities and textures of reparations, just as I did the different features and characteristics of emancipation. And then the final word, returning to where I began the talk, that there's something new that comes, I think, when we link the current discussions on reparations to the history out of which it comes, which is the history of unfinished emancipation. And if we can make our current discussions more historical, more grounded in history, it actually makes the solution to our problems more tangible. In some ways, our past already has those solutions registered, encoded in it. We're being asked to read that past and then to find the current day applications very urgently, to bring about repair. Okay, so I'll end with that. Thank you.
So we're going to move to the Q&A now, and I'd just like to thank Kris for a wonderful presentation, and certainly something that's given us a lot of food for thought. While some of you will have a degree of expertise in this field, for others, some of what you were saying here might be quite new. I know there are certain aspects of what Kris's book revealed that were quite new to me, because I'd never even looked at emancipations in these ways. And one of the things that stood out for me, Kris, was the whole idea that abolition was the kind of fig leaf behind which particularly white academics of slavery have often hidden. Yes, there was slavery, but there was abolition, and we had this guy, and he contributed so much from the proceeds of enslavement. But we also had this guy, and he was an abolitionist. And there's always this attempt, if you like, to neutralize the impact of the enslavement of our people by the kind of white benevolence that is purported in the whole process of abolition. And you just completely smashed that to pieces with this argument. I mean, what brought that about? Why did you feel the necessity to look at abolition and emancipation in the manner in which you did?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, how did slavery end? And did it end? That is a very important question that should be made a question, and not taken as rote or as a given. And the answer to the question that it did not end the way we think it did, not only that the ways that slavery was, as an institution, was brought to an end happened by design to continue forms of bondage afterwards. That response, which the archive gives, is a troubling response. But I feel that, and I think most of us would agree, that if we abide by simply retelling narratives that are structured or interested in shutting off our proper understanding of the past, it doesn't make the problems of the past go away. That we can continue to deny, we can continue to disavow, we can try to silence, but it doesn't make the problems that are created by this legacy go away. They return. And so, your question makes me think about my experience of walking around the Blue Hole, because there's a different way of engaging with our difficult history together, which is not about whether we look at it or whether we run away from it. And often the running away is what the response is. It's almost a panic response, I think. But there's a different way of engaging, which is to walk around it and to reckon with it, and to sit with it, and to let it change us, and by changing us, give us new possibilities for how we talk about the future together. Right? So that's where I think we have a lot of space. We have a lot of space to still grow, together.
And I was asked to review the book for Penguin, and I was quite surprised at the way in which you tackled the subject matter and how you juxtaposed your treatise, if you like, with the concept of these ghostly apparitions. So I wonder if I might just read a little bit from what I did for the review, because I probably couldn't say it better than I said it when I was doing it. In The Black Ghost of Empire, The Long Death of Slavery, and The Failure of Emancipation, Kris Manjapra masterfully juxtaposes the present with the absent, revealing the truth of what once was by illustrating vividly what was not. Using his own ancestral Afro-Asiatic lineage as the nexus upon which the narrative arc of enslavement and emancipation gyrate, Manjapra illustrates how the enslaved continue to compensate their enslavers through the injustices of so-called apprenticeship, indenture and colonialism long after their purported quote-unquote emancipation had occurred. Indeed, the process of emancipation itself is characterized as a legal mechanism of support for the slave owners transitioning out of slavery, done to the detriment of those whom they enslaved, who received nothing and whose lot barely changed in the process. This legal posture, treating slave owners as the victims of property loss rather than enslaved peoples as the victims of crimes against humanity, was defined by the slave owners themselves and enacted incrementally for their own benefit. Manjapra illustrates the absurdity of white European enslavement practices designed to not only exploit, degrade and dehumanize black people, but also to dismember their history as a nefarious network of voids created by enslavers to render the black experience into a malaise of invisible ghostly apparitions.
Beautifully written.
So why the ghost?
Ghost, the Black Ghost of Empire, the title of the book. Black literature meditates on ghosts a lot. We think of Toni Morrison, right? But we can think of many other ways in which the ghost shows up. Derek Walcott's poems have a lot of ghosts in them. Black literature often talks about bones that still have voice or still live in the attic, or that call out from the burial grounds, or that call out from the ocean. So the diaspora knows about ghosts, and we also know, I would argue, that ghosts are kin in a certain way. What I mean by that is and I'm also thinking of Avery Gordon's work about haunting. She writes about slavery and haunting. That what ghosts in history are really doing, because we know this experience of something's bothering us about this history. We can't let it go. We're not just going to move on. We know that feeling. Something's wrong here. We know that feeling. But what that feeling is there to do is social work. It's to do the social work of asking for us to look back and to create a new relationship to something that has been broken. So I think so ghosts are there to repair relationships. That's what I think they in social terms they exist. We live in a haunted post-traumatic society. But they're not about making us freak out so that we shut them up in the basement again and hope that they don't come to get us. No, they're there to ask us to do something more than what the everyday roteness of our public life together suggests is necessary, which is to be in a different kind of conversation around repair. Repairing what? Repairing our relationships to the past, concretely, repairing relationships to those who have passed before us, who have not lived justice, who died not knowing justice, but also repairing our relationships to each other today, right? That repair work is something that more and more we see the need for it. I mean, this 21st century that we're in, how can we not recognize that this is our calling, I mean, just as much as we see so much devastation and it's frightening what is happening on national scales around the world, isn't it, and think about the environment as well, isn't it also interesting that the response to so many of these problems today seems to be the demand for some kind of reparative justice, some form of response that takes our past into consideration and that seeks to redeem or make up for or reconstruct something new. That's our moment, So I do think we live in a haunted time, but I think it's needed. Yeah.
And that sort of segues quite nicely into my next question, which is about the narrative as it currently stands. Obviously, there's been a lot of work that's been done to start the process of decolonialization. But are we in the process of decolonializing, working within a flawed paradigm in itself, to the point where we're trying to unpick something which is so ingrained in every aspect of our being as victims and every aspect of the society in which, are, if you like, the institutions and the narratives which are adopted by the perpetrators or the descendants of the perpetrators, that we're just sort of doomed to be in one of these voids and just sort of like a dog chasing its tail and never really getting anywhere. Is there space for a new narrative, for a new way of looking at what happened to us and how we are now, and the forms of reparative justice that should take place by way of restitution and making whole, that is determined by us, not as a byproduct of these legal processes which we have no part in, but we're subject to and continue to suffer from.
Yeah, absolutely. And my very concrete answer to that question is, well, let's look at an essential level what every single emancipation got wrong. And what every single emancipation got wrong is that the enslaved who were being freed were never involved in the process, ever. They were never included in the actual process of their own freeing. And therefore, what freedom was to look like and what it was to mean and what it was to entail was never on their terms. And so that dynamic of excluding the victimized group from the actual decision-making table happens to be a very continuous, ongoing feature of how institutional power works. And at the same time, when we look at legal theory tells us, if we want to go back to Roman law, that the guilty party may not be its own judge. Like, that's a tenet of law. But that's how emancipations work, that the guilty party got to also be the judge.
But that's also how reparations is working. When you look at the case, for instance, of Barclays Bank, when they were first identified as having benefited from enslavement through their acquisition of Arthur Haywood and Sons. I think the Guardian article was 2007, was it around when they first got outed by that American research group? I think it was 2007. And they responded by saying, well, it was only a little part of our portfolio, it was only a small thing, it wasn't really our main business. We recognise it was wrong, we did get some benefit, but what we'll do is we'll do a bit more for diversity. So, in what court would the perpetrator be in a position to determine whether or not the victim had a cause of action? To whether or not the causal link was there, to whether or not the victim was worthy of compensation, and to determine, if any compensation, at their own discretion, what form that compensation would take. How absurd is that? Because that flies in the face of every legal maxim from Roman law, the Bill of Rights, even to contemporary tort. You would never allow the perpetrator to dictate the terms, the liability, or the quantum for the victim. But yet, when Barclays Bank were asked, when Lloyds of London were asked, when the Bank of England were asked, when Green Day Brewers were asked, we had the same response from all of them. Oh yeah, okay, fair enough, they minimised it, it wasn't that bad. However, we'll do this. How does that wash, and wherein lies the justice in that process? Because that is the tone of the debate currently around reparations. Even that in itself is being determined on the terms of the beneficiaries of slavery, with the absence, if you like, of the victim within that narrative.
Yeah. To me, there are two levels to the answer, and they relate. One level is, if we take a quick survey of what's happening in terms of international reparations movements today? What are the courts that they are turning to? It's a kind of a concrete question. But then there's another question that I want to briefly talk about that's embedded in what you're that relates to what you're referencing about the framing or the narrative of what reparations means. So in terms of what are the courts or the arbiters for what reparations might entail today, it's clear that that is still very debated and not only just debated, that the established order that governments today, Britain, the United States in particular, are fighting very intensely to make sure that the aggrieved parties will continue to be excluded from the actual discussions of what reparations should entail. On the other hand, I don't know how successful they're able to be in the end. I mean, taking the American example, what's just started happening in California suggests that there is a movement that's not just at work, but that's quickly growing momentum in which Black communities in California are defining what reparations entails, and they're not defining it only in terms of how much should the check be. The latest intermediate report of the Reparations Study Committee in California, I think, has 10 different dimensions of what reparations entails, just like the CARICOM community has 10 dimensions, just like the National African American Reparations Commission also has 10 dimensions, making the point that this is a large and complex discussion, and it's not going to be resolved by having a conference and deciding on the amount of one check payment. That's not sufficient. So that gives me great hope to see that kind of really on the ground legal activism, critical legal activism taking place. In terms of the other point, I wanted to just pause to say that over the past few days, I've been, really more than 2 weeks now, I've been reading for fun this beautiful set of essays called The Silent Interviews, and they are written by Delaney, not Martin Delaney, but the more recent Sam Delaney, who's also a science fiction writer, a Black science fiction writer. And in The Silent Interviews, what Delaney, who writes a lot about race in his science fiction, what he observes is that wherever we go, whatever we do in society, we're always inhabiting institutions. And what an institution is simply a set of codes. And what a set of codes are basically a set of authorities, of things that you can do and things that you cannot do. And generally there's somebody in charge of maintaining those codes. But his brilliant observation is, as long as we are in a set of codes, we always have a way of playing the codes, playing the code in a disruptive way, in a liberatory way. In other words, a set of institutions or a set of codes or a set of authorities is actually never what it claims it is, which is an enclosure or a trap or a plantation, and it's not that. It always is an opportunity to create, to transform, to resist. And so I welcome this current moment in which we have this language of reparations that is being spoken more and more, on the streets and newspapers, even when it's not happening in ways that I think are, I get upset. Why are we always talking about the check? It's not just about the check. But at the same time, the fact that it is, again, increasingly a topic of discussion, a language, a framework that's being used, means that we can have this conversation now, and we can have it in a university like this. And there's something important and disruptive about that. So we get to mess with those codes, and I think we're seeing that happen today.
And there was another major theme that came through in the book, which is why I referenced about how you discuss not just what's present within the debate around emancipation and abolition, but also what's absent. And one of the things that you point out is the absence of true recognition for the extent of black self-emancipation. The limitations on the references to just how many uprisings there were, just how many attempts, and in some cases, with varying degrees of success, liberations from the African side, through on the ships, within the Middle Passage and so on, and also the Caribbean and the Americas, that within the gamut of emancipation and abolition, there is this entity where black people are not as perceived as this sort of docile class of people that were just going along with slavery because white people were inherently superior and they were inherently inferior and therefore they couldn't really do anything about it. There was this constant presence of resistance and not just the Maroons, but also just impromptu revolutions and on plantations and on ships and so on. And they seem to be not even really considered within the context of abolition. And in many cases, it may well have been those things that triggered, even the discussion about emancipation in certain colonies. So can you elucidate a little bit more on that and why you think that was absent in the debate and what we need to do about that in terms of changing the narrative?
Yeah. As much as I have framed the book about the history of these emancipation laws and processes, there is the other side of the story, which is the history of the revolts and the rebellions and the plantation strikes, the marooning that was taking place, and the varieties of other forms of resistance, including simply loving each other, that black people were always doing. So that in some ways we could see that work that black people were doing, was actually the impetus, like you're saying, for these various dates of emancipation. In other words, slavery ended not on the terms ultimately of the enslavers. It ended because they had lost control of the terms. But within that crisis of this institution no longer being tenable, they were seeking to jump ship to get out of the burning house, greedily grabbing every last thing they could keep of their, what they imagined to be their patrimony. So I think that's kind of maybe the best way of thinking about this long history of emancipation, as opposed to a kind of gift giving, which is what the master framework is. But one other thing I wanted to say about the question of self-emancipation is that while it's actually interesting that when you look at how black people talk about freedom, they tend not to talk about or celebrate the term emancipation on its own. They do tend to celebrate and use and lift up the term self-emancipation often. They add self-emancipation, or they talk about liberation, or they talk about getting the free, or getting my freedom, or a variety of other ways of locutions to talk about this experience. But one of the most powerful pieces of literature based on this theme of self-emancipation is Martin Delaney's Blake, and I write about it in the book. And in some ways, he wrote it in the end of 59 to 61. And it's like this beautiful crystallization of so much of what black resistance means. Because what self-emancipation meant for Delaney in the novel is it captures so many of those features of on-the-ground reparations I was talking about. But what speaks to me most as I'm talking about the novel now is, number one, he writes the novel in a way where enslaved people on different plantations across the South look up and see the North Star, and by recognizing the North Star, they find out a way to find each other. And the book is about how these dismembered communities who were intentionally dismembered and alienated and had these voids separating them, how they found a way through finding their North Star to find each other. That is what the novel is about. And they find each other not just in the United States, but also in Cuba and then in Africa, and there's this Pan-African story that he tells. And not only do they find each other, but they do something together, which is in the end of the novel. And he's a poet, so we have to think through the poet's language. He says they are now creating Africa together, A-F-R-A-K-A. So they're creating not Africa as it was, but this new society, community that has not been imagined before, called Africa. And they're doing it in Cuba. And it's this international group of black folk who are coming out, who are the emancipados of the world, who have self-emancipated each other and are reconstructing. And it also makes me think of W. Du Bois' idea of black reconstruction.
That is exactly where I was going to go next. You just stole my thunder there, which was that you also reference the Philadelphia Negro. And I'm thinking about the idea of black knowledge production in the post-slavery period, because there's also this sort of perception that, obviously we were primarily illiterate because they made us illiterate, but there were literate people like Du Bois, like Booker T. Washington and others who were writing, really important kind of, treaties at that time, which, would go on to shape a lot of future things. And one of the examples, I think, was the beginnings of using the kind of visualizations of data, which was initiated by Du Bois. He was the first guy to show how to take data and create these visualizations, which are what we do now with data. And it's the credit or the lack thereof for these innovations that were taking place within a sort of intelligentsia among black people in knowledge production in the post-slavery period that you referenced, which is also absent from the debate because of popular misconceptions of every black man, black woman being illiterate at the end of slavery, and therefore having these docile communities that were just, needing to be cared for by the Freedmen's Bureau or something, and couldn't really do anything for themselves, and they were just singing and dancing and getting drunk because of the now we is free kind of thing. But when you look at things like the Philadelphia Negro and what was going on with Du Bois and others at the time, it shows you a totally different dimension, that there is a powerful impetus for black knowledge production at that time, which is kind of relatively absent from the debate. So what was the significance of that, and why was that sort of brought into this?
Yeah, I love that question. It's interesting to think that one of the things that slavery, and also the way that slavery ended, did, is that it made black people into masterful readers, by which I mean masterful interpreters of their world. And we could say that Du Bois, who grew up his mother was a domestic servant in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, very close in a certain way to slavery, to slavery in New England. Where did he get this ability to read? Where did he get the ability to interpret the way that he did? It wasn't given to him. It was something that was emerged historically, that he accessed through his experience. Both, obviously being a brilliant person, but there's a richness to his black experience and that of his parents and that of his ancestors that we need to understand to make sense of Du Bois. And it's interesting to me, so Prince Hall, who was a black lawyer working in Boston in the 1770s, 80s, and 90s, and was a very important kind of early Boston reparationist. He, in his sermons, he would tell the technically illiterate black community that he was preaching to, he would what's the word for this? Valorize their reading ability by recognizing that, they could read the stars. He always said, our people, we know how to read the stars. We know how to make sense of our direction through the constellations. And I think he meant that in a number of ways. We know how to read how a society works and how power works and how to get around power. That's a form of reading. That's very powerful. It's a form of social interpretation. Or when we think about the importance of Black, the significance of sea travel in Black experience, what we call the pirates, right? Many pirate ships actually were free Black people who were able to read the seas and read the stars and navigate and hide and do what's needed in order to keep themselves free. That's high-level intellectual work. And so it's interesting to recognize the sophistication of interpretation, social analysis, and of communication that Black communities developed in order to do things like say two things at once, or to be able to pass rumors and secret plots so that they could do what they needed to do to continue their lives. That is something I don't think we appreciate enough. Not that it's not been written about by some scholars, but there's a reason why Du Bois was able to read the way he did. And it's not because he had white teachers. That's not where it came from.